yourself a website online, Squarespace are the people you want to work with. I've personally always been intimidated at the idea of even starting a website, but these guys got me up and going within half an hour. I spend more time on character creators in video games. It takes you just a handful of minutes to get the basics, and they walk you through everything, no matter how intricate you want to get. They have a ton of preset designs that you can just get up and going at your heart's content, and it all looks super professional. And for those of you who want to get a little bit more bold and creative, you can go behind the curtains and tweak every little thing to your heart's content. If you're trying to put together a shop, portfolio, or whatever, they have tools that can track your growth, help you build an ad campaign, integrate with other social media platforms, and again, all of that is streamlined and easy to understand. It takes very little effort to get something clean and professional up in front of the world. Having your own domain name looks super sexy on a business card. And to make it even easier, if you head over to squarespace.com/gameapologist, you will get 10% off your first purchase. Seriously, you could get this done in the time it takes you to watch this video. Thank you again to Squarespace for helping out, and on with the show. Hello there, I'm Nick, and this is Portable, where we look at the portable ports of console games. You ever looking through a Game Boy section at your local retro game store and do a double take and think to yourself, wait, they made a Game Boy version of that? Well, that's what this show's all about, to help satiate that curiosity and let you know if a game is worth your time. I rarely see anybody talk about these games, and, well, as you'll find out, that's usually for a good reason. All the same, I'm curious, and if you are too, I hope you'll indulge me for the next few minutes. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at the Game Gear version of Sonic Spinball, which I recently mentioned in my last episode of Game Apologist, covering the Genesis version. It's mostly the same game, certainly the same concept, taking Sonic through a pinball adventure to yet again stop Dr. Robotnik, and like the Genesis game, Spinball on the Game Gear is split up into the same 4 levels and still follows the same nothing story and shares a lot of the same assets. There is a different soundtrack, and the level introduction screen is just terrifying. Before it was just a mountain with Robotnik's face, but now the entire thing is just leering at you as you make your way up its innards. The major difference you're going to see here is the collision detection and physics. Like I mentioned in the Genesis episode, while that version felt a bit off compared to the normal Sonic games, this one feels way more off. I wouldn't call it unplayable, but if you had told me this was some bootleg version of Spinball, you could probably give me a compelling argument. That would probably be the most glaring and unfortunate difference, but the developers mitigated some of the frustrations by making the game a little easier. And there are different layouts to these maps, sometimes. Okay, mostly toxic caves, but even then it's not that far off from the original design. And they do have a different boss here. A good majority of the rest of the game strongly resembles its big brother, but they still hold back from some of the more confusing layouts. Even the notorious final showdown level, while still tough, is nowhere near as aggravating as the original version. Maybe it's just because I've played 2 versions of Spinball back to back, maybe I don't have the difficulty high enough, but despite the janky physics, this version was much less of a chore to get through. Spend enough time away from the classic physics and get to grips with what's on offer, and it's a good time. I did notice that we seem to get Sonic unrolling a little more often than the Genesis version, and he has a jump noise from the original games. You can actually spend a good majority of the final fight without ever smacking against the paddles, and this is especially noticeable with the completely different bonus stages. Unlike the Genesis version, where they gave you a different kind of pinball to play, this time they put Sonic into a more traditional platforming area. You're still going to spend a lot of your time as a ball, but you need to make your own momentum, spin dash, and jump around to collect rings, giving you more direct control over Sonic. These sections, more than any other, will show you just how off Sonic feels when compared to the Genesis originals, or even the other Game Gear games. But I still enjoyed the change-up, and the Egyptian motif. Not sure what they were going for here. Maybe they were alluding to an ancient civilization within the mountain that Robotnik had corrupted? I don't know. Overall, the game is fine. Now that I've beaten it, I have no desire to play it again, but I'm glad I experienced it. I don't feel it's anywhere near as bad as I've heard others say it is. That said, I also didn't know this game came out a year after the Genesis version. I guess that explains the different box art. I know it's a less powerful system, I just think it's a shame that the first game was rushed out the door. Yet this one is a year late and plays worse. Seriously, you could make an argument that Mario had a better portable pinball experience compared to this one, but I'm gonna put those problems on the limitation of the hardware. Honestly, looking at this as a kid in 1994, this was more than a commendable effort. If you love the home version, I'd imagine the portable one would satisfy you just fine on a long road trip. So, would I recommend it? Well, that's not an easy answer. If you have no interest in this system or Sonic, then no. I can barely recommend the Genesis one as it is. But I would recommend experiencing this game if you're at all curious. Because if you are, you're probably a fan of the Game Gear, or D-Makes, or Spinball, or Sonic in general. And it's worth at least playing around with it for a handful of minutes just so you get an idea of what they managed to cram into this little cartridge. And if you're watching this video, video, you're probably one of those people. That's who this show is for. People who want to see how much of a console experience they can cram into an underpowered piece of hardware. What had to be stripped out? And does what remained manage to carry the name of its more powerful counterpart? Spinball is unique, because as far as I know, it's the only Sonic title that is a portable version of the original Genesis edition. It's not as good in some instances, but a lot less frustrating in others. A worthwhile experience for the curious. The rest of you, carry on with your day. I love Vigilante 8, like a whole bunch, but I've actually found it quite challenging to find a decent video review of the Dreamcast version of Second Offense, which I take great offense to, so expect to see that game on this channel again in the future. Now, if you missed it back in the car combat heyday, this weird subgenre was everywhere in the early 3D days. Made famous by Twisted Metal, Vigilante 8 came in to give that series a run for its money, bringing better graphics, realistic physics, and I use that adjective very loosely, and, my favorite part of the games, fully destructible environments. Everything blew up real nice, and for the time, very realistically. Vigilante and its sequel quickly became some of my favorites, and even though there was a story, I really couldn't tell you what it was. Honestly, I don't even think I've won more than a handful of matches. These games are tough. I just had fun rolling around and blowing stuff up, and I'd argue that these environments are what helped make it stand out from Twisted Metal. So how on earth were they going to bring that destructive satisfaction to the Game Boy Color? Well, as you can see, not very well. There's a reason why you don't see reviews for this game, and that's because, well, there isn't much to say. This is about as stripped down of a version of Vigilante 8 as you can expect for a 8-bit handheld. They really should have called it Vigilante 8-bit, that would have been precious. But with that said, it does what it needs to do. The game now takes place from a bird's eye view. You pick out your vehicle of choice and pick one of the recreated maps from the console version, and not all are here. I'm noticing a lack of my favorite, the Ghost Town. But even if it was, well, look at this. I know the Game Boy Color isn't a powerful machine, but it can certainly look a little better than this. And what's worse, but not unexpected, you can't wreck the map or really interact with it at all. Still, they try to play around with the elevation on occasion with hills and the like, but it sometimes doesn't do a good job showing you where the elevation changes happen, and even that aside, you're probably going to find yourself stuck a lot. And if you're hoping for an 8-bit rendition of the series staple groove, well, you have little luck here. No music in any of the stages, except for that crunchy version of the main theme on the title screen. And you still get digitized voices of the characters, yay, but that gets annoying very quickly when you start getting spammed with special attacks. There seems to be a lot of focus on these characters. They even adorn the cover of the game, which is strange because, well, who's buying these games for the characters? It's not like there's a story mode here. There's an arcade mode, a road trip mode, which is basically just a one-off match, and I think a couple of survival modes. There's really not enough difference in any of the modes to dive in and get dirty with. It's all the same boring, badly controlling car combat on one of the only 5 arenas. But there's still a couple of gimmicks here that might have helped pass the time back then. The cartridge itself had a rumble feature, and it supported the link cable if you had any friends you wanted to play with. The game is bare bones, boring, and a poor replacement for the proper experience. But that's why we're covering it. This stuff happened all the time on the Game Boy, and that's what makes it so interesting for me. You want to know if I recommend this game? No, of course not. You're not a bored kid in the late 90s with nothing better to do. Now, make no mistake, this game is still playable. And if you have a soft spot for top-down car games, and more specifically, NES-era gameplay, who knows? You might have a good time. Honestly, with what they're working with, there's really not much more they could have done with this game. The top-down perspective works, the gunplay works, I even managed to win some rounds. This is about all you were going to get for Game Boy car combat. It's not like Twisted Metal was going to show up on this thing. We'd have to wait 6 years for the PSP to come out for that to happen. It's not a broken mess, it's not unplayable garbage, but what you see is basically what you get. And the more I talk about it, the more I kind of respect this little game. Bare bones, but the basic gameplay does the job. If this series had survived to the days of Game Boy Advance, it would have been nice to see these basic elements of a game, well, a little more advanced. As it stands today, this is the only portable version of Vigilante 8. Well, legally, anyway. If you have an interest in the 8-bit and you like this series, give it a shot. You'll have everything you'll ever need from this game in about 15 minutes. If you've never touched this series, do not start here. Play literally any other version because they're all dirt cheap. Well, maybe skip the XBLA version. I don't know. We'll have to get back to that sometime. Anyway, I'm off to play more of the Dreamcast version of Vigilante 8 Second Offense. I'm really upset they didn't make more of these games, and also that they didn't call it Vigilante 8-bit. In an effort to prepare for the inevitable rise of our lizard overlords as they come up from the Earth's core to take over the surface world, I thought thought it might be fun to take a look at Gex. The series has always fascinated me. I love the premise, taking the sassy lizard through television-themed levels, but I've never actually beaten any of the games. I've dabbled in them plenty, but there was always a little something holding me back, a little coat of polish away from pushing me through the levels. Regardless, it's a series I've always wanted to dive back into, and one I remember fondly, despite the flaws. But that intrigue grew more once I discovered they actually made some adventures for the Game Boy Color, and this is for a couple of reasons. First off, it's a 2D version of a 3D console game. Wanted to see how they crammed that into a Game Boy. And second, well, if you weren't aware, these games are sequels to, well, surprise, Gex. And that original game was a 2D platformer. So I look at the Game Boy version as both a demake of the source material and as a continuation of the original game's mechanics. And while it is both of those things to an extent, it unfortunately is not a great time. So what's wrong with it? Well, the basic idea of making a 2D version of Enter the Gecko, while ambitious, not a great idea. See, the console version of Enter the Gecko was a 3D platformer. And if you're not aware, those are usually collectathons. These have you running around the map exploring and collecting a certain amount of items so you can get a lay of the land and explore things to your heart's content. And unless you're a Metroidvania and have a map handy, that doesn't work too well on a 2D plane. You'll constantly be jumping back into the same levels over and over again, tasked with a different objective. Since you don't have multiple directions you can run off to and explore willy-nilly, you're going to be running into the same areas, dealing with the same hazards, yet somehow still getting lost every time. Now, this would be a little bit better if you had the same versatility as the original Gex game. And while you essentially have the same moveset, the controls aren't great. I mean, they're decent enough. I started off the game and first thought, well, it's not so bad. I could get used to this. But then I quickly learned that you have a very limited amount of walls you can climb on, unlike the original game. And you have this horrible automatic run. See, that's another thing in 3D platformers. Since you usually have a joystick, depending on how much pressure you put on it, depends on how quickly your character's moving. But for some reason, they thought they'd try and emulate it in some weird way. You always start off walking slowly, then after a few seconds you break off into a sprint. Unlike Mario, where you basically have a run button, or Sonic, where it gradually picks up the momentum, this automatic setup has as many problems as you would expect in a format like this. Missing platforms or not being able to react to an enemy in time, it's kind of rough. And again, the level design doesn't help. Like I said, you're going to be doing these over and over again trying to accomplish different objectives. There's no map or pointers or anything to help you navigate through this mess. Even the hub world's a nightmare to get through. Oh, and they have a password system. Yes, this game that's too big for its own good has a stinking password system. And of course, it's a mess. Look at this insanity. So get this, not only do you have to fill out like 30 spaces with arrows, you also need to keep track of which set of arrows you're using. Hold down A and it'll give you one set, and holding down B, surprise, gives you another. Or you could just use save states on an emulator. What? What's Eidos gonna do about it? They don't care about this game. This thing's like $2 online. But we have yet to cover the worst offense of this game. It stripped out all the personality Gex is known for. I mean, come on, look at those glasses. That Scale Boy has so much radical-tude. Unlike the console games, you won't be hearing the same one-liners over and over again. And I'm sure many would think that that's a plus. But come on, it's Gex. It's just not the same without the outdated references. How am I supposed to know when it's tail time? All that said, this is still strangely charming. I don't know what it is, I just love seeing games like this. And it's far from unplayable. You can get through it, it's just not as polished as the likes of Mario. All the same, I appreciate the collectathon style trying to be incorporated in this weird 2D setting. And things only got better with its sequel. Yep, Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko also had a Game Boy Color version, Deep Pocket Gecko. Oh, that's adorable. I get it. That's Also, did anyone else think it was weird how Enter the Gecko is like a parody of James Bond and Deep Cover Gecko is clearly a parody of Austin Powers, which is already a parody of James Bond? So does that make that a parody of a parody? For the most part, Deep Pocket Gecko is not too different from the last game, but there are some changes, and most of them are for the better. The Gex sprite looks a little better, I think. Well, he at least gets cute little costumes in each new level, but he's also somehow even more impatient than Sonic the Hedgehog. Seriously, the moment you let up on the movement controls, he just stares at you. Like, that's the immediate animation, just stares straight at you. What is your hurry, friend? Calm down. He also controls a little better. That awkward speed up problem is completely removed. He stays at one constant speed the entire time. And yes, that makes all the difference. And unlike the last game, this one's made exclusively for the Game Boy Color. The last one could be played on both the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. This one is exclusively for the Color, and the power-up shows. Levels are way more detailed this time around. The levels are huge, and it at least tries to emulate the level layout of the 3D games. Not well, mind you, but it's at least kind of fun seeing the strangeness of the original version on the Game Boy. I'm not exactly giving this a recommendation. If you're looking for a solid platformer, you're not going to find it here. But if you are interested in checking out what an 8-bit 2D version of a collectathon looks like, if you're that hardcore of a fan of Gex, well, it's fine. If you are familiar with the Gex series and you know the console versions like the back of your hand, give these a shot. Seriously, I would love to know how hardcore fans take to this version of these games. Now, movie tie-in games are widely considered a bad time, but the 1993 Disney classic Aladdin not only proved to be a good game, but two different versions of a good game, which has sparked a long-standing debate among retro enthusiasts. Now, I grew up with the Genesis version, so I'm terribly biased on this front, as well as a lot of Sega kids of the day, as Aladdin ended up being the third best-selling game on the system, and you can see why. The game looked absolutely amazing. Virgin Games worked with the animators from the movie to bring these sprites to life, and it shows. Now, it ended up being so hard that I never passed the first few levels, but I always had a fun time. Then there's the SNES version. While the sprites aren't as animated or resemble the movie quite as closely, this was still one of many quality Disney platformers produced by Capcom back in the day. Still Aladdin, still a platformer, still the same basic premise, but still unique and good enough that you could really go either way on the argument on which one's superior. At the end of the day, regardless of the console, everyone was a winner. Despite the enormous popularity of these two games, and knowing of the existence of both since they were first released, I only recently came to learn that they actually had portable versions of both. Just not where I expected. You'd think the Genesis game would find its port on the Sega Game Gear, and while that system did get an Aladdin, it was its own game. Perfectly serviceable and technically a port of the Master System version, and actually followed the movie rules of not touching anything in the Cave of Wonders. While a fine platformer on its own, it's not the Genesis game. But this is! That's right, for whatever reason, even though there's a Super Nintendo version, the Sega Genesis version of Aladdin was the one ported to the Game Boy. And bless its little heart, it's trying so hard. The Sega version had Disney animators bring the sprites to life, and the little Game Boy, oh man, look at you go. It's a slow, chuggy mess. But the game is here. Of course, the problems of the console version are a little more pronounced. Frequent blind jumps, somewhat confusing level design, and that stupid lava escape. And there are a few new problems that pop up just from being on the Game Boy. Did that camel just spit a knife? Do camels eat knives? This version of Aladdin is trying to do things the system simply can't do. The game moves at just a few frames a second. This chuggy pace slows down everything, and it's so bad that it makes the whole game less enjoyable. And while the 8-bit renditions of Aladdin's classic tunes are serviceable, it doesn't always seem to match up with what's happening on the screen. No, well, at least they used Whole New World in the recreation of the most iconic romantic moment from the movie. You know, the part where Aladdin threw apples at Jafar until he exploded? So they crammed the Genesis game onto the Game Boy cart, stripped it down to just the bare essentials, but is it worth playing on the go? Well, in 2019, probably not. Like everything else we cover on this mini show, it's an interesting attempt for sure, and it plays fine. If you were a kid when this came out, I think you would have had a good time, and if there was any way to speed this up, it'd be much closer to a full recommendation. I played through it, found it a little less challenging than the console version, but as it is, it's still not very good. But strangely enough, this would not be the last time this game would port to a Game Boy. A few years later, it was also brought to the Game Boy Color, and apparently only for the Game Boy Color? Did anybody tell Nintendo? Do they know the Genesis? Oh man, they're gonna be so embarrassed. Once again, the cute little references and a lot of the quirky animation is drastically reduced compared to the Genesis game, but the increased power shows. Not only does this version look a little bit better than the Game Boy version, it also plays better as well. Controls are much smoother. The music actually matches the Sega version, and it's just so cool seeing and hearing an 8-bit version of the Genesis game. Yeah, you're not going to see little details hidden in the environment, like what happens to misbehaving Disney park goers. My only real gripe is that I found it somewhat challenging proceeding forward in the Cave of Wonders in one spot. I had to watch YouTube playthroughs to figure that out, and I know that was not an option for kids back when this first hit store shelves. But that aside, the Game Boy Color version did not do this game dirty. If you come across it for a fair price, I'd definitely give it a shot. So now we have two ports of the Sega game on Nintendo handhelds. Where's the love for the SNES version? Well, you would find that on the next generation of Game Boys. I'm not sure why they felt the need to replace the box art. The original was just fine. Also, Aladdin doesn't use a sword in this game, so what?
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
The Game Boy Advance version of the SNES game doesn't really do a whole lot differently from the Super Nintendo version. The only drawbacks being that you have a couple buttons less to play around with, and the audio quality isn't quite as nice, but that's not exactly news when comparing the two systems. The neat thing about the Game Boy Advance was having the power of the Super Nintendo in the palm of your hands, and a lot of the time, licensed properties, especially based on older movies, would not get a second chance at life. Thankfully, Aladdin made the jump, and deservedly so. While I'm sure it wasn't as much effort as making a brand new game, Capcom still had no real incentive to work with Disney to re-release the game, and I'm glad it's here. It's a little pricey these days, but it's still a solid port of a solid platformer and a reminder of why Capcom has remained such a prominent company in the industry all these years. And there you have it, these are the portable versions of Aladdin. Outside of the sluggish Game Boy original, they hold up really well. I can understand why Disney would dip back into these two games every now and then. But if you want to know which portable version I think is the best, well, it's obviously the original Genesis game on a Sega Nomad. Kidding aside, it's very clear that the SNES version is probably the best playing of the three games we've looked at today. But if I'm honest with you, I find the Game Boy Color version of the Genesis game way more interesting. What made the Genesis game stand out was its unique charm. It didn't play quite as well as the SNES version, but if I'm honest with you, I didn't think that version was anything special. A solid game, just nothing memorable. The Genesis version, while it had its insane difficulty spikes and leaps of faith all over the place, definitely had a charm that you just couldn't compare. And seeing them trying to emulate that on these tiny little machines is just fascinating. But like I said up front, whatever version you pick, you're probably gonna have a good time. Mega Man is no stranger to portable systems, having a series run right alongside his legendary run on the NES on the original Game Boy, and then having a new game out every week on the Game Boy Advance. But when it comes to the Game Boy Color, the Blue Bomber is strangely silent. Mega Man appeared in only 2 games on that system, and surprisingly in the form of Mega Man X, the spin-off series created to show off the upgraded power of the 16-bit systems after the initial 8-bit run. Yet, here we have an 8-bit version of Mega Man X, known as Mega Man Extreme. Yes, even in 2001, it was tired and embarrassing to use the word extreme, especially when you didn't know how to spell it. Maybe that's just what the X stands for? Is that his real name? Extreme? Is he fueled by Mountain Dew? I picked this up back when it first came out because, well, despite the fact that I'm not the biggest fan of the Mega Man series, the first game in the X series was, and still remains, one of my favorites. One of the most tightly designed games that use the tried and true formula we've seen in literally dozens of games. So seeing a portable version of this on a store shelf, well, this was a no-brainer for me. Sure, nowadays you can have all the mainline X games on the Nintendo Switch, but back in the early aughts, this was the best you're gonna get. Now, it's not entirely a port of the first X game. They mix up some levels from the first and second game, mix around some power-ups, and put in an all-new story with some contrived nonsense to justify fighting old bosses. As you can see with these can't skip the cutscenes, which is a shame because the story is, oh my god, who cares? Who cares? Game go! Okay, so when you get past all these new characters that nobody cares about, you can pick one of 4 stages, which is not out of place if you're familiar with earlier Mega Man Game Boy games. Outside of the 5th entry, the classic Game Boy Mega Man games would grab 4 levels and bosses from their console big brothers, mix them up a little bit, and get you on your way. Extreme seems to follow the same formula, but this time it's translated the more powerful Mega Man X to the handheld. The downgrade in graphics and audio are to be expected, and both are actually quite charming and work well here, but the real difference between Mega Man and Mega Man X is the control and speed. Unlike the original Mega Man, X can also dash and wall jump, which completely changed the level layout and action, making it a much faster paced game. If you want a breakdown of that, go watch Sequelitis. I don't know how any of you would have run into my show first, but if you somehow have, go watch it. Oh man, I missed that show. Anyway, I'm happy to report that the X formula translates to the Game Boy surprisingly well. There are some issues that arise. Despite the surprisingly smooth feel and control, the lack of buttons will prove annoying to fans used to having dash assigned to a specific button. You can apparently use the start button if necessary, but I was using the dash the same way I've always done it, double tapping the direction I wanted to move. So for me, this layout is familiar and welcome. What's less welcome is the screen crunch. That's nothing new for console games translated to smaller screens. This leads to off-screen hazards. It's a good placement of a ladder. And just like every other Mega Man game, they stick to the single-screen boss fight, which is a problem because the sprites in this game are much larger in comparison to their console counterparts. But hey, it's fine. I can beat the original Mega Man X in my sleep, so I'll just roll through Chill Penguin's stage and just shoot that stupid bird in the face until... Sorry, I must have... Let's try that again. That's not how this works. That is not how this works. I don't lose to Chill Penguin. Nobody loses to Chill Penguin. I don't lose to Chill Penguin. So it seems the bosses are tweaked a little bit for a little extra challenge. I think this is the first time I've ever died in a fight with Chill Penguin. I don't care if I can kill him with fire. I don't seek out another weapon to take out Chill Penguin. That's not how this works. And Spark Mandrill. Oh my god, Spark Mandrill. None of those little level tricks come over from the original game. In the SNES version, defeating Storm Eagle will lead to his airship crashing into Spark Mandrill's stage, making a lot of the electrical hazards depowered and ineffective. But here in Extreme, they're all working just fine no matter what order you'd hit the stages. And the fight itself, I hate to admit it, but I've been smacked around senselessly even with the body armor upgrade and ice weapon. Does any of this make sense to any of you people who've never played the original Mega Man X? Or are you just sitting here wondering why you're listening to a man scream about penguins and monkeys? My point is, video games are weird. And even if you're familiar with the original game, this version is gonna test you. They also do this weird thing where once you're done beating the 4 bosses and the final boss afterwards, you unlock a hard mode which unlocks yet another 4 stages. And once you beat those, you unlock the extreme mode, where they finally let you pick between all 8 stages. I have no idea why they set it up in such a fashion. Maybe they're trying to help players learn boss patterns, maybe they're trying to surprise veterans with the original Game Boy Mega Man setup. I have no idea. Look guys, I'm not here to nitpick every detail of this game. You have another couple YouTubers doing just that, and those videos are awesome. I don't care about this stupid story. I think the hard and extreme modes are weird, but I can live with it. All I'm here to tell you is, despite this being a technical downgrade and in turn an inferior version compared to the original 2 games it's mixing up, Mega Man Extreme is awesome. It was technically impressive back in 2001, and it still plays fantastic today. More than just a commendable effort stuffing in the 16-bit games into a tiny system. Mega Man Extreme strips away a lot, but leaves enough of what makes this series so special, and you can genuinely have a great time playing this even today. The controls are tight and responsive, which is essential for the series. Boss fights are indeed tougher, but they are certainly manageable. At first I felt like a lot of this was annoyingly cheap, and a small part of me still does, but as you track down upgrades, energy tanks, and heart containers, and well, just get good, you will see yourself improve, especially when you figure out the boss order. But even then, these bosses will not let you off easy. Like I said, I can play through the original X game in my sleep, grab everything and finish up the game in just a couple hours. But here, even though I've played and beaten other X games, and I have beaten this particular title more than once, the boss fights were still intense and left me on the edge of my seat. I feel like they picked out the right levels to rep the first 2 games. At least these are the levels I normally think of when it comes to the series. And maybe these levels are just less taxing on the Game Boy Color, or maybe these bosses just mesh together a little bit better when it comes to the power weaknesses. I don't really know or care, honestly. It works, and there's an 8-bit remake of the highway theme, and that's just the best. So yes, I could wax on forever about how neato it is to have a portable Mega Man X back in the day, but even in 2019, I still feel like I can actively recommend this game. Seriously, if you've slept on this title because you've already played the original X1 and X2, give this a shot. Hardcore fans probably won't find it as challenging as I did, but it is a remix challenge all the same. Besides, like I said, it does have an original story, as boring and useless as it might be. But I'm not a hardcore Mega Man fan, so I'm sure you'll get something more out of it than I did. And come on, I know I'm not the only one who loves seeing 8-bit versions of the iconic X characters and locations, or having some of those famous tracks demade and still sounding fantastic. And of course, seeing if the soul of this series is still intact when you strip away all the pretty paint. It thankfully does, and it does it well. There's something surreal about seeing this game in action, like it invaded the stomping grounds of its predecessor or something. What up, Grandpa? I'm here to party! I agree with everyone else when it comes to the arbitrary doling out of the levels. I feel like they were trying to make things a little easier for people who had never touched this series before. I mean, it had been away from a portable system for a couple of years at this point, and this was the very first time Mega Man X was available on this machine. But this was still implemented in a confusing fashion. They should have just had all 8 levels available from the start. It worked with countless other Mega Man games. I don't know why they started using it here. It's familiar, but it provides a fresh challenge. It's a charming remake that still captures the fast action of the original. This is a great game, and from what I hear, the sequel is even better. We'll save that for its own episode, as I haven't played it yet, so we'll get there in due time. Hello there, I'm Nick, And this is Portable, where we look at the portable ports of console games. Now, I'm playing fast and loose with the term port here, as there were TMNT console games based off the 2007 movie, and there were proper ports of those games on the PSP and DS. But our dear little Game Boy Advance actually had a very different game. This version was an arcade-style beat-em-up. Nothing surprising, Turtle games try to recapture the magic of the original arcade game in Turtles in Time every few years. What is surprising was just how good this game was. See, not only does it do a pretty solid job of recapturing what made those original games so good, but it also improves on the formula a little bit. And some of you might have already noticed something very interesting about this game. Something I didn't really connect back when I originally played this version of the game. This looks a lot like Scott Pilgrim. And before any of you say anything, I've been drawing my little avatar like this long before Scott Pilgrim or Ben 10. I know, white guys with untidy brown hair with a penchant for green clothing is a rarity, but I swear, no, this is based off of me, guys. I'm a real person. They're not real. I'm real. I've been doing this since middle school. If you weren't aware, the Scott Pilgrim game was awesome. I say was because you can't download the thing anymore. But holy crap, what a great little game this was. And that game was chock full of references to retro gaming, but it still had a style and charm all of its own. And it stuck with me after all of this time. And it remains one of my favorite games. And even though I haven't played it in years, the moment I kicked TMNT on and started slapping enemies around, I felt like listening to Anamanaguchi's Another Winner. I have no idea if I said that right, guys. I re-recorded saying that name so many times. I don't even think the band knows how to say his own name. Both TMNT and Scott Pilgrim take a lot of inspiration from brawlers in the past. Both are beat-em-ups with some slight RPG elements, borrowing heavily from River City Ransom with little shops you can visit to buff up your characters, and you can certainly see where they draw from the old-school Turtle games, TMNT especially. But there's still more in these details. The basic design of the enemies, the use of color, the beautiful little animations and details, even these little coins animate in a similar fashion. And both use pedestrians as fun dressing for the levels. This awkward guy in the subway is my favorite. Just look at that subtle animation. So I had to do a little digging. I had to see if there's any kind of connection between these two games, and shocker, Ubisoft Montreal had their hands in both games, and it shows. So yes, it goes without saying, this game is awesome. The animation is beautiful, the controls are slick and responsive, the fights are frantic, fun, and fast, the little hub area between levels is fun to explore, and they even give you cute little rewards for unlocking certain achievements, giving the game a sense of growth, satisfaction, and replayability. Of course, that doesn't mean it's perfect. It's based off the 2007 movie after all. And yes, look, I enjoyed it too. I am a massive Turtles fan, but come on guys, that movie's kinda dull. And in turn, the game's story is too. I mean, it doesn't even take place during the movie. It's just the four brothers, April and Splinter, sitting around recounting the movie after the fact. I have no idea why it's set up like this. They barely care about the plot of the flick. Why should you? And there are some frustrating moments I ran into, namely getting locked into cheap attacks with little effort to recover, especially with these stupid motorbikes. Sometimes I killed them off no problem, other times they knocked out multiple lives. I don't know why I couldn't find a healthy middle ground here. And it's a beat 'em up, so yes, the game is both super repetitive, yet super short. And being on the GBA, it's a solitary experience. No link cable options, nothing. You're playing this game by yourself. Look, by now you should know what you're getting into with this genre. And while the lack of multiplayer sucks, and this is somewhat repetitive, there's enough here to make it entertaining without overstaying its welcome. Also, to you hardcore Turtle fans, anyone else think it's weird that they kind of fuse some aspects of the 2003 show with the movie designs? Like they have Hun here in the first level, clearly based off the cartoon, and Shredder's helmet, which you can see in the trophy case is clearly based off the old movies, but get into the menu and it's based off the 2003 cartoon. It's just a weird inconsistency, but I'm about it. I thought the monster designs in the movie were pretty bland, so it's nice to see some variety. Man, that movie. I don't know, guys. I think I'm just realizing I don't like it as much as I wanted to. Oh, jeez. Also, you know what? I don't hate the new show. I thought it was kind of annoying at first, but it's growing on me. And 2012's version is just the best. Holy crap, what a cartoon. I'm getting off track. Let's wrap this up. Even though it's attached to a somewhat boring movie, they still show off a lot of charm that really makes this game stand out. It's easily the best of all the games based off this movie, and definitely up there as one of the best Turtle games. Honestly, the GBA had it real good when it came to the Ninja Turtles. And just like every other Game Boy Advance version of the Turtles games, this is way better than the console version. Seriously, any way I look at this game, it's a weird, wonderful little title. It's a good movie tie-in game, a true successor to the Ninja Turtle arcade games of yore, a predecessor to Scott Pilgrim. I mean, seriously, think of it that way. You ever want the Scott Pilgrim guys to work on Ninja Turtles? Well, here it is, right there. You want a movie tie-in game that's better than the movie? There you go. Ninja Turtles with a taste of River City Ranch. Guys, this game is crazy rad. Go play it. I can't believe this thing exists. A quality Ninja Turtle brawler got overlooked. How does that happen? Yes, I know Turtles in Time is great. I don't need you telling me that. Nobody needs you telling them that. Is it better than Turtles in Time? Does it matter? Just play the game. Just go enjoy something. Crap. If you grew up in the era of 3D gaming taking its hold on the mainstream market of consoles, you might have run across a Cruis'n USA arcade cabinet at some point or another. I loved it as a kid, and reading back on it, I saw a few reviews call it the spiritual successor of Sega's Outrun, and I could see the comparison. It was fun in its own way. The game claimed it would be running on Ultra 64 hardware and that it would be a launch title for the system. Well, it turns out everything in that sentence was false. The Ultra 64 got renamed to the Nintendo 64, the game missed the launch window, and it certainly was not running anywhere near as nicely as the arcade version. Cruis'n games are always a fun little jaunt in the arcade game that would later become watered-down mediocre messes on the 64. And for the third game, Cruis'n Exotica, not only did they release a console version, they also brought it to the Game Boy Color. So it might come as no surprise to hear that this game is a boring little waste of time. You drive, you try to pass other cars, and you get to a finish line across tracks that have absolutely nothing going on. Now, to be fair, the engine is impressive for the Game Boy Color. That 3D effect and changing perspective is really pushing this little system. And for that alone, it got me interested. I love games that push hardware, even if they end up being little more than tech demos. And in Exotica's case, that's really all you got. The problem with the Nintendo 64 version is that it strips out so much of the personality of the arcade games, which, when you get right down to it, is all that made those games stand out. I've always been more interested in what's happening around the track than the actual race itself in these games. And when the 64 version scales back on the spectacle, and then you have to translate that to a system that's 8 times less powerful, well, what can you really expect? Ironically enough, the most depowered version of the game, in its own way, is the most impressive. Like I said, they do some really cool tricks with the engine to give the game some emphasis on hills and other variances in the road. And as bare bones as it still races just fine. The vehicle selection is cute and you can pull off some tricks. It's alright, just not much more than that. That's really all I have to say, and if we ended things here, it'd just be a 2-minute video. So let's take a look at Cruis'n Velocity. There is also a Cruis'n game on the Game Boy Advance. It doesn't have Exotica in the title, but it seems to have its levels, and I'm not dedicating a whole episode to this thing, so we're just going to cover it here. I had no idea this game even existed until I started doing some research for this episode, and boy howdy, do I understand why. This is a fascinating mess of a game. While it does have the classic Cruis'n sound clips and environments from Exotica, Velocity plays unlike any other game in the series. While the other Cruis'n games, like Outrun before them, have you race in basically a straight line, there's never really any sharp turns. You're usually staying at a constant pace unless you crash. In Velocity, however, you are doing nothing but turning, and most of these tracks are in tight corridors. The game uses the same graphics engine as Dark Arena, as the developer of that game did this one as well, making it one of those unique Game Boy Advance games that uses a 3D polygonal environment. They really took advantage of the 3D tech, as a lot of the challenge comes from staying on the course, not running into walls, and keeping your car from spinning out. It's different, it's unique, and it's pure trash. It just plays so bad. I mean, so bad! These levels don't feel like they're designed for cars, or, I don't know, anything really. You'll run into things or go down a dead end or shoot off a ramp straight into water where you'll slowly sink in and then get placed right in front of the water again. Is that a pine tree growing out of the pond? Is that pine tree supposed to go there? I don't think that pine tree is supposed to go there. There's no signage indicating where you need to go, like the game will give you multiple options on your track, but only one right answer. You can turn left or right here, might as well take the right, and then, oh, look at that, you're in a wall. The game lets you drive up some stairs, or you can keep going down the city road, but only one will progress you further. And just look at this poor sap. He didn't make a jump and he just got stuck here for the entire race. And these tracks are so short. This Vegas level feels like I'm just driving around a block looking for a parking spot. And while I love seeing the 3D effect, the game is somehow uglier than the Game Boy Color Cruis'n game. Just look at this mess. Why are there so many corridors? Oh yeah, that's what I think of when I think of Iron island, cave tunnels with fluorescent lights, and these touchy little controls. You turn left or right too much and you're gonna spin out. And this game requires a lot of sharp turns. And other times just has these big obnoxious hazards just right in the middle of the track. And if you spin out, smack into something, or fall into water, you're done. You're not gonna catch up with anybody. It's no fun. It's a sloppy product. It's a really bad game. I'll be honest, guys, this game got a half hour out of me, and that's all I'm ever going to give it. There's cups, there's a championship mode, it's all the same tracks, it's all the same hideous gameplay, and it's just an awful experience. I could not manage any better than 8th place in anything I race, and I'm not going to spend any more time trying to do better. These games aren't fun, but man, they are fun to look at. They're horrible, but they try to do things with their systems that are so completely different from anything else in the series, and they push their hardware in interesting ways. Just don't play these games to get the Cruis'n experience. The arcade games are dumb fun, and these are just dumb. They're interesting tech demos, nothing more. You probably don't need me to tell you what's on your screen right now, but for the sake of emphasis, that is indeed a green hammerhead shark nitro boosting over the Hollywood sign. And if that doesn't strike your fancy, then we've got nothing to talk about. Thanks for stopping by on your way over to the Sonic content, but for the rest of you who took in this glorious sight and responded with, "Tell me more," well then I'm going to tell you more. Welcome to Portable, where we look at the portable ports of an arcade game. Today we're looking at Cruis'n Blast. Now you might hear that name, and depending on your age, you might respond in one of two ways. If you're older, you might be thinking to yourself, is that a new Cruis'n game? Or if you're younger, you might be thinking, hey, isn't that racing game I found at my local failing laser tag family fun center? And you'd both be right. Blast is indeed a revival of the long dormant Cruis'n series found all over arcades and Nintendo 64s in the mid-90s. And Cruis'n Blast did just get released on the Switch, but is not exactly new, as this particular entry has been around since 2017, at least in arcades. It was brought back from the dead by Raw Thrills and also Nintendo, I suppose? I mean, their name's all over the arcade unit. Cruis'n games have literally only ever appeared on Nintendo systems, but I don't actually know if they own this series or if it's Raw Thrills. I can't find it anywhere. If anyone can tell me, let me know. But regardless of that, Raw Thrills made the game. These are the same folks who have made pretty much every modern rendition of all kinds of arcade favorites you'd find at Dave & Buster's. And as a cherry on top, Raw Thrills was founded by Eugene Jarvis, the man who directed the original Cruis'n USA. So obviously, this franchise is back in the right hands. But can this game live up to the legacy of the other Cruis'ns? Yeah, obviously. Look, I love the Cruis'n games as much as the next 90s boomer, but let's be real, that wasn't exactly a high bar to clear, especially when you consider the last few pathetic attempts to make some money off the name of the franchise. You can actually go check out a video I did on the Game Boy games if you want to learn more, because they're oh, there's something. Well, in the case of Blast, thankfully Eugene has not lost his touch, because Blast is a blast to play. Yeah. Alright, I'm funny. Thankfully not just in arcades, but also on the Switch as well. But unfortunately not everything made its way over to the handheld. This is the Switch after all, so they had to cut back on some graphical goodness from that original arcade release. Eugene mentioned that Blast moved over to the Switch with some surprising ease, and they got it started up and running without too much issue, but unfortunately a lot of their shaders and special effects took their toll on the frame rate. And on top of that, they kept the tradition of having a plethora of creatures to mow down in the arcade version, but not an animal in sight on the Switch. How am I supposed to satiate my bloodlust, Eugene? So yes, there is a noticeable graphical dip, and even though modern consoles could run the arcade original just fine, like I said, Cruis'n has only ever been ported to Nintendo consoles, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. Still, not all is lost. Raw Thrills had their priorities in order and knew where to make sacrifices, because this game runs at a smooth 60 frames per second both dock and portable, and even with multiplayer that runs anywhere between 30 and 60 frames. They focus on making the game run as smoothly as possible, and their hard work paid off. And even without some extra special effects, the levels themselves are still bombastic, over-the-top racing goodness. Gameplay is still intact, and it's as straightforward as ever. You race to the finish while avoiding environmental hazards, keep track of your nitro boost, Mario Kart drift around corners, which can also give you an extra boost, and throw in a Burnout-style takedown for good measure. Yeah, there's a trick system, and there's boosting and all this other stuff, but it's very simple gameplay, and like Cruis'n games before it, not much will actually slow you down down. Most things you hit might as well be made out of styrofoam. And while we don't have the arcade racing wheel here, the controls themselves are incredibly smooth and responsive. It's not remotely realistic, and I'm just fine with that. Seriously, drifting feels more like a suggestion more than an actual requirement. And for the portable player, you do have tilt control options as well as auto acceleration if you're so inclined. Didn't take advantage of them myself, but it is nice to see Raw Thrills made this as accessible as possible. This is an arcade racer after all. And on top of that, the Switch version does offer some more substantial options in terms of gameplay. But while the trailer for the game does advertise 29 tracks, it is just mixing up the core 5 tracks that came from the original. And some of these quote-unquote new tracks are ridiculously short. I mean, like less than a minute long. But still, they do add in some really dynamic assets and shake it up enough that it doesn't feel repetitive. And all these extra tracks can be found in the modes exclusive to the Switch release. You of course have your classic arcade mode, but on top of that you do have some tried and true options you'd expect from console racers: Time Trial, Multiplayer, and Cruis'n Tour. These are campaigns of 4 races, all with a consistent theme. And this is where you'll find the rest of the 29 tracks to fill that list out. Again, it's fun to see some shakeups in these already dynamic tracks, but for the most part, they're mostly cosmetic changes while mixing up the set pieces. But you know, during one of the races, I had to land on a ship during an alien invasion and had to launch off the other side of it through a flaming donut, all while being a unicorn. Yeah, I've seen that ship a couple times up to that point, but there's enough here that it kept me interested. And that alien invasion is actually one of the tour themes. There's also a night mode, which is just a few races at night. The storm mode, which adds a bit of drizzle. A dinosaur tour, which just takes dinosaurs out of one of the race tracks and puts them on the other race tracks, which is fine with me. I love dinosaurs. Also a helicopter tour that just has helicopters firing missiles at you, as well as a tour that has cops hound you through each of the races. They don't provide much of a challenge, at least not through easy, but I noticed through normal they got a little bit more aggressive, and hard mode and going forward, yeah, they do become a problem. So it does shake it up quite a bit here. In these tracks, as well as the original 5, you can collect cash and keys and earn XP. Completing tours and collecting keys will unlock cars, or well, it'll give you the option to buy cars. Even after you unlock them, you still have to spend cash and keys to truly add them to your roster, and the XP is there to level up your car. Leveling up will bump up stats a little bit, as well as unlock cosmetic options. And by unlock, I mean it gives you the option to buy. And while there are a lot of cars to level up, they all cap out at level 5. And even then, it won't take too much time to tone up your favorites, and if you're so inclined, polishing off the rest of them should only take a few hours. Because every race type is gonna get you cash and XP, and that includes the time trials. But not only that, you can actually collect keys in the time trials as well. There are 3 in each track, and yes, that does include the tour tracks, but regardless of the difficulty level, once you collect that key, it's yours forever, regardless of the mode you grabbed it in. And while some are more challenging to grab than others, I didn't have to look up a single location for these things. They're all relatively easy to find. And again, you can take the worry of winning a race off your shoulders and just collect these in the time trial mode. I honestly don't mind this. Yeah, I can see the appeal of tracking down each key during the heat of a race being an extra level of challenge, and that's certainly a way to go if you so desire. But I've always been a sucker for time trials and racing games. I love being able to explore at my leisure and just cruise. Yeah, despite the title, it's not something you actually do a lot of the time in these games. And I know with the keys, level up system, reuse tracks, everything added may sound like tedious padding, but I promise you it's not. There is just enough here for this type of game to make it fun to experience on your own, and of course with other people. And for me, it was a worthwhile purchase. I do think $40 might be a little steep, but honestly outside of that, there's just enough here to keep me coming back for more. But not so much that it makes me bored. They make it easy to unlock everything I need so I can just pop it in for multiplayer down the road, or just revisit this every now and then just to experience these insane levels again. And none of the collectibles or gameplay or any of that is going to be as robust or technical as the likes of Gran Turismo or Forza. But also, I'm a Triceratops. I don't need this to be another Gran Turismo. We get this kind of crap every year, and I miss arcade racers so much. I know this is all spectacle, but I am here for it. I love this stuff. No, it's not as crazy fun as Burnout can be, but when's the last time we got a Burnout? Give me more games games like this. I love it. This is why video games exist. Spectacle racers are mindless fun with crazy crap happening all over the place. And if I caught your interest with that hammerhead shark at the top of this video, then you already know you want this game. If you're comfortable dropping $40 down on a game where you'll have mostly everything unlocked by the end of the day, then I say go for it. There is clearly a lot of care put into this very simple, silly good time. This was a surprisingly solid port and a redemption for previous portable Cruis'n games, and it feels good to have Cruis'n back and better than ever, and I certainly hope we see more in the future. Hello there, I'm Nick, and this is Portable, where we look at the portable ports of console games. And goodness gracious, I've missed this particular show. I've been wanting to get back to it for a long time, and I figured with our subject today, now is as good a time as any to jump back in. Because the games I'm discussing have quite a bit of controversy surrounding them, and a lot of opinions are flying around, so I thought I'd throw my hat into the ring. Or, nope, sorry, the hat throwing's in Odyssey. It's on this collection. It's, I guess I'll squirt my opinion into the ring. I'll squirt. What's wrong with me? Yes, Nintendo has just released the Mario 3D All-Star Collection, a compilation of Mario 64, Mario Sunshine, and Mario Galaxy. All of them undeniable classics, and all of them playing pretty freaking spectacularly on the Switch. So what's the problem? Well, depends on who you ask. Some find the presentation lackluster, others find the game amount lackluster, and pretty much everybody agrees that the limited release, both physically and digitally, is kind of BS. Yeah, so if you're watching this in the future, you might not even be able to buy this thing off Nintendo's store. As of this recording, September 2020 until March 2021, 3D All-Stars will be available, but after March, you're not going to be able to find it physically, well, unless it's secondhand, and apparently it's just not going to be on Nintendo's digital store either. And I have to agree with the people that think this is kind of BS. Nintendo is notorious for faking scarcity, and they're being pretty blatant this time around. There are no two ways around that. I'm not going to try to defend it, so don't expect me to play Apologist for that. I think that's a crummy business move. And I also believe that because it is a limited release, Nintendo feels it can justify not really putting a whole lot of effort into the presentation of everything. The menu itself is just the 3 games and then their 3 soundtracks. You don't even have separate menus for those things. Like, they just wanted to bulk out that first menu so you can pretend like you have a little bit more than what you actually do. And even with the soundtracks themselves, you can't really mess around with the times or anything like that. You can't like skip through a track to get your favorite spot or anything like that. You can play it and you can turn your screen off, but that's about it. And because it's only being released for a few months, I think that's why they haven't put that much effort into the actual presentation of anything here. Which is truly offensive if this is supposed to be representing 35 years of Mario. Like, why don't we have something celebrating the history of this or getting a little bit more behind the scenes? Love to see some of those wacky old ads or all those missing assets we were just made aware of from Mario 64. Why am I discovering that Luigi was a real thing because of a leaker and not from a compilation like this? Especially since that first game, Mario 64, did get remade. It would have been really nice to see the DS assets scale up a little bit and then given true 3D motion instead of me having to take my DS copy and throw it into my 3DS so I can pretend like I have a joystick that works. Also, in case you haven't played Mario 64 DS on a 3DS, that's how you should play it. I know it's only 8 directions, but a joystick's going to save you so much pain on your thumb. Trust me. And the lack of Mario Galaxy 2 is pretty egregious as well. Like, we've had years of compilations doing this properly. Sonic Jam had that whole 3D world just made up of assets of a game they weren't actually going to make and turned it into something truly memorable. I adore that. And it made the games in the pack really feel like museum treasures, you know? Like, these were relics, these were masterpieces. And really, the games were only a few years old at that point. And again, with Mega Collection Plus, I mean, I missed the 3D stuff from Sonic World, but the presentation was still pretty fantastic. Even in Nintendo's own roster, the Kirby Collection, hell, Smash Brothers, all of them do a better job representing the history of the games they're presenting. And Nintendo, if you're gonna treat these games like priceless treasures that belong in a vault and can only be shown off for a rare time, like, show them a little more respect. Show your audience a little more respect. Mario 64 changed everything in gaming. I want to discover more about it, and I want to hear from the people who made the game. I really don't understand why Nintendo does this. We have not seen that much effort in a Mario compilation since, well, the original Mario All-Stars. And they even got got lazy with that game, they re-released it on the Wii with this big fancy box and a booklet, and all the game disc had was that one ROM. 3D collection is not that egregious, but still, man, like, why are you doing this to us? And I'm also seeing people comparing this to the recent Spyro and Crash compilations. Those were $40 and they completely reskinned those games. Now, I wouldn't say it's quite as easy reskinning the Mario games. I mean, they're from different platforms, and while they have a lot of the same base abilities, they're not the same games. And truthfully, I really don't know if I want these games messed with graphically a whole lot. That said, Mario set that precedent with the original All-Stars. They upgraded the graphics on all the original games. That's not to say these games aren't worth the asking price, but everything about this compilation feels like the bare minimum. Are all these games masterpieces? Yes. When you combine them all, are they worth $60? I think so, but I know Nintendo can afford to do more. I know Nintendo can afford to keep this game on the market more than a few months. And while I'm happy they smoothed out some of the assets in Mario 64, whoop-de-doo, it's not impossible for them to give us a little bit more. And if they'd just taken one more step in any direction, I feel like people would have been praising this top to bottom. If you'd given us a proper museum in the game, or if you had thrown in Mario Galaxy 2, or if you kept it as it is and then sold it at $40 instead of the $60. If they had just done one of these things, I feel like the asking price would have been completely justified. Instead, they put it at $60, which is I'm on the fence kind of a price for a bunch of old games, as good as they are. Then added on the limited scarcity garbage just to push people into buying it, and you know what? It worked. And it worked on me too. As much as I'm complaining about all of this, I bought it because I love these games. I really and truly do. Yeah, I'm known as a Sonic fan, but I'm not going to pretend like Mario 64 isn't just a stunning game. I cannot believe that game holds up as well as it does all these years later. So, complaining aside, how are these as a portable means to play these classics? Honestly, while I am a little bit miffed at the price or the lack of extras, the games play really well. And it is kind of bold of Nintendo to just throw out Mario 64 basically as is. Yeah, they polished up his buttons and don't have as many crinkles in the numbers, but it's basically the same game we got back in 1996. I know there's some tweaks here and there in terms of audio, and it's more based off the re-released version of the N64 game in Japan or whatever, but this is Mario 64. And yes, there are parts where it is showing its age. Some of these stars are BS. There are just a few too many slopes for my liking, and the game is ridiculously punishing in terms of screwing things up. You launch a cannon off the wrong direction, you're probably gonna die. And there are a few too many enemies who will punish you just by throwing you off the side of the level, either killing you or forcing you to make your way all the way back up. Regardless, you can tell that these were geniuses experimenting with the third dimension, and that genius shines through. I'm not sure if we're ever gonna do a deeper dive on Mario 64 on my channel, but just know I adore this game, as frustrated as I can get with some of these challenges. Mario Sunshine, on the other hand, seems to have a bit more controversy surrounding it, and always has, mostly because we waited quite a long time for a follow-up to Mario 64, and then Mario showed back up in, well, a Super Soaker backpack. And in a tropical setting, like, that's usually just one level. Why is that the entire theme for the entire game? Also, some of the pollution monsters just gross me out. You know, how they bubbled out and then just sounded like an upset stomach. Also, they're kind of, like, super brutal at times. Like, the squid, like, just rip off his tentacles. Regardless, it's good to see this game in HD, like, official HD, and on a portable system. It holds up beautifully, and I forgot how much I actually missed all these flood abilities. It does suck that we no longer have the pressure sensitivity, and I still get screwed up every time I go behind the shoulder, and I don't have an inverted option to use with the hose, but that's something that's keeping me from enjoying myself in this game. And while I have a lot more to play, I think this might be the definitive version of Sunshine. It was one of the prettiest games on the GameCube, and seen in HD just proves that. This game will never not look good. Also, I love that Bowser's speaking just fine at the end of Sunshine.
How dare you disturb my family vacation?
But then you get to the start of Mario Galaxy. It's like the opening of Mario 64 where you get to play with his face, except that little pointer hand just completely lost its mind. It's just slapping like, just that silly putty face of his. It's just like the funniest thing. It's just like, I don't know how I forgot how much I loved Mario Galaxy. This game is so beautiful. It is so stupidly pretty. It really feels like the Wii, the system that it was made for, was holding this thing back. I know a lot of people were worried about how the star bits were going to work because the game apparently relied so much on the pointer, but I'll be honest, I always felt it was forced in when I was playing the original game. Like everything that stupid pointer did, I just wondered to myself, why can't I do this with a button? I would have been happy with those stupid star bits just being gone completely. They're just a distraction as far as I'm concerned. Yes, you can use them to slow down bosses and feed Lumas and whatever else. It really just felt like it was there to make the Wii matter. In this version, while docked, you can use a Pro Controller or your Joy-Cons to good enough effect to get the job done. And in portable mode, you can just use your touchscreen to grab star bits. And thank God, Mario's spin is finally put to a button. No longer have to worry about that stupid wrist swinging crap anymore. And it looks great, it sounds great, it's just great. This game's wonderful. And ultimately, that's kind of the point, I guess. That's why I'm not really and truly angry about the lack of content when it comes to this compilation, because the games themselves give you a hell of a lot of content. Nintendo doesn't need to fluff this up with museum pieces or behind-the-scenes stuff. They don't need to put in any other games because they know that these 3 games hold their value. They know they put a ton of effort in the first time around, and there was not a whole lot they needed to do to make this work. I'm upset about the price, but not to the point where I wouldn't buy it. I don't feel like I've been cheated out of money because all 3 of these games are quite wonderful. I really don't care if you think these games are overrated. That's your problem. I'm sorry, but these are masterpiece games. I will play Mario Galaxy before I play almost any 3D Sonic game. I'm sorry. I love a bunch of those games, but they just don't compare to what Mario can do in 3D. Do I like the characters as much? No. Have I been more engaged with the story and design of stuff from Sonic's world? Absolutely, but in terms of pure gameplay, it's really hard to beat these 3 games. And that's why I'm just giving you a bare minimum. This isn't a deep dive in any one of these games because I'm not going to rush through these. I spent a little time with all 3 of them, and all of them are running perfectly fine. All of them work great on the go, and it feels wonderful having these 3 playable anywhere I want them to be. So yes, I am happy with this game, but despite all these games have given us, Nintendo should have been a little more giving in terms of a fully priced compilation. So yes, still middle of the fence here. If you grew up adoring Mario, this is probably the best way to experience all 3 of these games, even if you're missing out on pressure sensitivity in Sunshine or exact precision shooting in Galaxy. And yes, even though they did improve on particular things and add a whole bunch of extras the first time they made Mario 64 portable, I'd argue that this version of the original game is still probably superior to the dolled up version that came out for the DS, simply because you have true 3D movement here. We can debate back and forth, and honestly, I'm looking forward to actually diving deeper into 64 DS for another episode of Portable. And I am frustrated that Nintendo didn't make that answer more definitive for me. Might not have been easy to upscale a DS game and then bring them over to the Switch, but if anyone can do it, it's Nintendo. They have the source code, they have the money, and if any game deserves that much attention, it's Mario 64. No, I'm just kind of rambling at this point. Let me know if you like a deeper dive into Mario 64 or Sunshine or Galaxy, and I'll be happy to do it. But in the meantime, I'm gonna enjoy myself. I'm not gonna rush through this, because at the end of the day, it's the games that matter, and they didn't skimp on that at least. I have been trying for some time to figure out how I was going to come back to Jurassic World Evolution. When the game originally released, I did a video covering my basic thoughts on the package as it was represented at the time, but also put a heavy focus on the IGN review, which gave it a 4.8. They have some bad takes every now and then, but for the most part, I've always considered IGN to be like the baseline for what most people consider a game's quality to be. I'm not usually going there for hot takes or some unique individual interpretations of some games or deep thoughts on them. Nothing like that. It's the site I would consider to be as close to a Metacritic score as Metacritic itself. And as a follow-up after all the DLC came out and watching IGN to see if they would update their score, the original plan was just to do a follow-up video asking the simple question, should IGN update their score for Jurassic World Evolution? But little did I know that they did update their review in April of 2020. I guess. I'll admit I only skimmed through it, but I didn't really see much of a difference, and the score certainly hasn't changed, which is weird because they've gone from their 20-point system to a 10-point system. So I guess all of Dan Stapleton's arguments with Angry Joe ended up being a moot point. So, Good job there. I don't know. I've said this time and again, I have plenty of respect for a lot of the people who work for that company, but I am done fixating on their opinions. I've tried to be as polite as possible when it comes to Dan Stapleton, but the dude seems pretty insufferable anytime I see him on Twitter, and I'm not really interested in engaging with him. We are both adults who have different opinions on a video game that is licensed to $1 billion property. Who actually cares what IGN does with their score at the end of the day? 10-point scale, 20-point scale, I don't even visit the website anymore. But I still have to bring this up because, unfortunately, I do have to lean a little more negatively when it comes to the Switch port of Jurassic World Evolution Complete Edition. That's not to say I think this game is a 4.8 out of 10. It is nowhere near that bad. That said, I don't think this game is a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. I do think it's a very worthy spiritual successor to Operation Genesis, but upon my return to this game, while there are improvements and plenty of extra content, I still think I would much prefer if they had just ported Operation Genesis over to the Switch. Operation Genesis does not have anywhere near as much content as Evolution, but it doesn't waste your time with tedious stuff that really isn't a whole lot of fun on a return visit to the islands. In Operation Genesis, you just pick the size of your park and you get going. And you keep going until you build your park to a 5-star resort. It's simple, it can be a bit slow going, but it's very relaxing, it's very satisfying, and yeah, you do have to deal with tornadoes and loose dinosaurs and all this other stuff, but if you're good at the game, you can actually avoid all of that stuff. And it just gets straight to the point. There are some extra modes, but the meat and potatoes is right at the get-go, and even if there isn't much variation in the gameplay, it is still a game you can pick up, spend multiple days dicking around with one island to really personalize and cherish and enjoy. And when you're done with it, you put it down, and maybe every few months or every couple of years, you pick it up and start all over again, and it's a great time. In Evolution, they have you go through the 5 islands that are remarked upon in Lost World, which is a nice touch, but like I said in my older review, you're probably going to be ending up making the exact same type of attractions and building locations every time you run through these islands, because there are so many restrictions on the borders they provide you. And I know that's part of the challenge, but I don't know. I wasn't really enjoying having to do all this all over again when I picked up the Switch version. That's not to say I didn't have some fun every now and then, but by the time I was finally starting to feel like my island was my island, the game would have me pack my bags and jump to the next, and I don't know, there's just no permanence to any of it. Sure, you can go back and visit them whenever you wanted, but I don't know, I'm just complaining about the replayability. I will say, I have noticed that I'm not running into the same AI behavioral issues I did when I first played this game on the PS4. This seems to be a much smoother experience than what we had a couple years ago, and that is very commendable. That's awesome. And I would be lying to you if I said I was not excited to finally jump into the Return to Jurassic Park DLC add-on. It was great to hear the actors come back to reprise their roles, but again, there's a massive focus on missions, and while I have yet to complete it, I'm not having the greatest time. It's perfectly serviceable, but it's just more of the same. Still, I would be fine with all of this. I would be perfectly content with everything I was doing and really sit down and take my time with all this and do it all over again and build up another set of parks and ultimately have a nice, relaxing, fun time with this whole thing, but there is one glaring issue with this version of the game that I cannot get around. This will not be an issue that everybody else has to deal with. This largely depends on how you play the game and what your own personal tolerance level is. But I have to say, the handheld mode of this game is so blurry. I mean, so damn blurry. Like, I honestly thought someone smudged Vaseline on my screen. I thought my contacts had dropped out of my eyes the moment I turned on my video game. I thought all the raptors became slightly more accurate because they all suddenly had a fluffy set of down feathers. Put the game in handheld mode. I can't see us if you play the game in handheld mode. I'm not a graphics snob. I've certainly played more than my fair share of portable games with downgraded graphics, but this is something else. This is more than just downgraded textures. I really can't think of a time when games were literally blurry, like you're playing this with your glasses off. You're squinting at the screen. It's not to the point that you can't play it, but it's enough for me to say that I was very disappointed with spending $60 on this thing, and after a few hours, I was frustrated and I was done trying to make this work for me. Like I said, I know this will not affect everybody the same way. The beauty of the Switch is that it's a portable machine that doubles as a console when you play it on your TV, and those who play it almost exclusively on a television, you're gonna be just fine. Yes, of course, you're still gonna have a graphical dip compared to the other versions, but it's nothing offensive. As you can see from my recorded footage, it's perfectly playable. Not the most beautiful thing in the world, but it does the job. And again, maybe you're not bothered by a blurry screen in handheld mode. Outside of this one problem I cannot get around, there is still so much content packed into this product. But regardless of all the DLC they provide and the updates to some of the issues I originally had with the original release, I still have to complain about what is here because I play the Switch for its portability. That's why I threw down 60 bones for this version of the game, and I don't think that particular aspect of it should be discounted just because there are some other means to bypass this. I know some people only have a Switch to work off of, and that's why I'm telling you about these other opportunities for you to play this game, but like it's really that distracting to me. And yeah, I am going to complain about stuff that is not here, because they could have done some things to make the Switch version of this game actually stand out from the other versions. All the text on screen remains the same size, and while it is much sharper than the actual graphics, they are still super microscopic on handheld mode. And I'm sorry, even with all the extra content here, if you're going to be charging $60 for this and still release it in this state with handheld mode, you could have at least done a couple of other things to make the Switch port, I don't know, a little more accessible. A park builder sounds perfect on the Switch. It sounds perfect as a mobile game. And if they incorporated some touchscreen aspects to that, I think I'd be slightly more forgiving for the blurry problem. There is a great opportunity here, and they didn't take it. I'm not a developer. I can't imagine even getting this game to fit on the Switch was an easy thing to do, but come on, man. I still don't think this game is as bad as Dan Stapleton says it is. I still don't think, even with the blurry problem, it's a 4.8 out of 10, but I also don't think it's a good enough game to tolerate the strain on the eyeballs, especially at this asking price. I honestly would recommend saving your money, especially if you have other means to play this. Of course, like most other games, the PC version is the superior way to play it. They keep bragging about how quality these dinosaur models are compared to other video games, so obviously the PC is the best way to view them, and of course, you have mods that can further extend gameplay. And obviously, a park builder just works really well with a mouse and keyboard. And hell, this thing is on sale all the time, be it on Humble Bundle or Steam, but just, man, $60 for a digital release of a 2-year-old game? Nah, man, that's not cool. Like, I don't even have a physical copy that I can slap on my shelf and just kind of grimace at every time I look at my games. And I've waited a couple months. This game has been out since November 2020. And that was just in case Frontier would properly respond to the complaints I've seen from fans about the blurriness. Hell, maybe even a price drop. But no, they felt that this was okay to release at full price. And I wasn't happy throwing $60 down, but I wanted to support the developer. I did love the original version of this game, and I wanted this on the go. But now the only tolerable way for me to play this is on my TV. And quite frankly, I have other ways to play this game, and it looks and plays way better there. I've been waiting all this time to finally jump into Return to Jurassic Park, all this extra stuff, and all this on the go so I could give you guys a proper review on portable, and because I'm also a huge Jurassic Park fan, and I just don't have the heart to do it. I spent the Switch tax because I play the system on the go, and this really let me down. I'm sure working on a system that's basically running on a 3-year-old Android chip is not an easy task, but that doesn't get me back my $60. I did go onto the subreddit to see if anyone else was bothered by this mess, and sure enough, there was. And I was happy to see that there were people from Frontier responding to this, but it was just standard canned responses, just telling people to take their complaints to the Frontier site. maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe with some more time removed from this and more time adjusting to the blurriness of the handheld mode, I won't care as much. But I'm really sorry for letting anybody down who was really intrigued to hear what I had to say about Return to Jurassic Park. I've only played the first 3 of 6 missions, and it's more of the same, and quite frankly, I just have no interest in experiencing that nostalgia on the handheld. And the more I play this game, the more it just makes me want to play Operation Genesis instead. And I know a lot of people have been complaining that Frontier hasn't bothered to put in swimming reptiles, or do some more substantial updates like giving us a few bigger maps to work with, maybe get rid of those obnoxious pylons to power up the areas, or giving the guests a little more to do like they did in Operation Genesis. And I'm with all those folks, but at this time I would assume that all of this would probably be showing up in a Jurassic World Evolution 2 and not in DLC that's just adding on to what we already have. And considering all the support we did get after the initial release, and considering they did bother to release a Switch port all this time later, I'm gonna have to assume that they are working on a sequel that will be releasing a little bit closer to Dominion whenever that finally comes out. So I'm not too worried about not having some more Meteor upgrades. I do understand people that did expect more from this developer considering what they've made prior to this and how much work they did put into this after release. But as long as you don't play this in handheld mode on the Switch, this is still a very good starting game for park builders. And I still prefer more streamlined park sims like this, just because I want to spend a little more time with the dinosaurs. But I will tell you this, I have never been more convinced that a Switch Pro Edition is coming, and hopefully soon. I mean, Nintendo has set that precedent with all of their other handheld systems, at least all the successful ones, and it's clear that a lot of developers are hitting a wall when it comes to porting games onto this machine. I'm usually not too interested in incremental updates with consoles, but we do have the PS5 and Xbox Series X out now. The Switch has been around for 3 years at least, and that is still at least $300 with 32 gigs of storage. It's time for a proper upgrade to this system. And once that happens, I really hope Frontier comes back and boosts the game ever so slightly so it is a proper, enjoyable experience on the go. I'm sorry to focus this entire video on something that will be largely inconsequential to a lot of other people, and I'm sorry I can't even properly show that to you since I can't technically record from screen when it comes to handheld mode. I know it seems like I can't see the forest through the trees, but I can't even see the damn trees, they're so blurry. Look, I'm not done playing Evolution. I'm gonna get to Return to Jurassic Park one way or the other. I just don't have it in me to do it on the Switch, and that really bums me out since I spent so much money on it. And I know I'm being way more negative than usual, but I had to vent. That said, I don't want my shortcomings to keep you from having a good time. It is still a fun game, and if you are a Jurassic Park fan who has yet to experience it, and you can experience it on the TV as opposed to handheld mode, well, if you can justify $60 for a digital release of an old game, there's still a lot here, and it's still really impressive that you can zoom in and out as quickly as you can on handheld mode. This game is still doing quite a lot of work, regardless of what it could have done or my own personal hangups with the visual fidelity. So, for those of you who can look past it, I hope you do, and I hope you have a great time with the game. I really did not want to complain about this. I really did not want to make this video. I genuinely like this game, despite its flaws. But to those of you who would share my frustrations, I hope this did give you fair warning. Hello there, I'm Nick, and this is Portable, where we look at the portable ports of console games. And I need to tell you this up front, this episode was not originally intended to be a standalone experience. This is part 2 of a larger video discussing every version of Sonic Colors. And because of that, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about might not make sense out of context, or it might seem like I'm just bringing up things out of nowhere as I continue points I was making in part 1. The only reason I chop this up is because I have a very old computer, and it was chugging badly when I was trying to edit together a 90-minute behemoth all on its own. And I figured this would be the best compromise. We'll just split it up and we'll combine it all later. But if you have not seen part 1, there's going to be a link in the description, and I'm sure I'll put it up here somewhere for you, just so you're not caught off guard. Because I really only talk about the DS version of Sonic Colors for like the first half of this video, and even then there's a lot of comparisons to the Wii version, and yeah, it just doesn't make sense by itself, so just wanted to give you the heads up. With all that said, let's hop back into it with Sonic Colors DS. This version, having been developed by Dimps who made the 2 Rush games prior, made their version feel like a 3rd Rush game. And in turn, Colors DS is often considered a part of the Rush trilogy, as that series never got a proper 3rd entry, but this one still feels very similar to what Dimps had built up prior. And if you are a fan of those games, you're likely going to enjoy this one as well. Not every change might suit your fancy, and I'll admit it's been far too long since I played Rush 1 and 2 to give you a proper comparison, but the lack of a playable Blaze will be sorely missed by Rush fans. And there are a few personal gripes I have with this game. I've never been a fan of the somewhat flat designs of the environments, and being on such a small screen, it can be a bit of an issue when you not only have to run fast, but boost as well. But that second screen does help mitigate the issue somewhat. Sure, you can't always see everything right in front of you horizontally, but Dimps has definitely improved on their enemy and hazard placements. And of course, you do have a better idea of what's above and below you, and the levels are designed with this in mind. But not only that, the game itself is designed with boost in mind. All the mechanics work well together, all while implementing a lot of moves you're gonna find in the console Big Brother. Actually, let's just get into it here at the beginning, because there are some interesting changes you're gonna notice right off the bat when you compare this to the Wii version. First off, the game starts things with a proper cutscene, showing Sonic and Tails arriving at the theme park. And I get that people prefer jumping right into the action with the console version, and I think that worked very well for Generations, but for Colors, I always found the flashback of the elevator after a couple levels just kinda jarring. I know it's a very minor detail, but I do feel the pacing is just a little better here on the DS version when it comes to the story. I know they have a lot more limitations, but for me, this was the first indication that this version was trying to do things a little bit better than the console version. Sonic and Tails arrive at the theme park the same time the player does, and it helps adjust you to this strange new world in terms of narrative pacing as well as gameplay, as we can see with an optional tutorial. And I appreciate that it's both optional and, well, that there's a tutorial here at all, because while this does share a lot of similarities with the console version in terms of mechanics, it still plays very differently, and even changes that might seem somewhat arbitrary can probably throw you off if you're expecting a watered-down version of the Wii game, because this is definitely not that. There were changes here I genuinely forgot about, and was surprised to see after I got done playing Sonic Colors Ultimate and the Wii version, because some of these changes address some of my critiques of the console version. For instance, you don't double jump, you instead do an air dash, which makes more sense because if you did a homing attack without a target, it would look something like that, so that makes sense. Like I keep stressing anytime I ever talk about it, I don't always like homing attacks on a 2D plane. It was brought into the 3D games for a very specific purpose, but all that said, it is implemented fairly cleverly here, rewarding players who react quickly with optional paths that would be somewhat hard to reach otherwise. The wall jump is still here, but it only works on walls with specific patterns, which completely removes accidental jumps that I kept having in the console version. But that's gonna be a double-edged sword depending on what you prefer. The Wii version's wall jump, allowing you to jump anywhere, means you can get creative with it, but the DS version means you can only use it in very specific spots. They place it sporadically, sometimes being an extra boost just to get you up a corridor if you fall a little short, and sometimes it's its own unique platforming challenge by placing spikes in certain spots, forcing you to land those jumps very carefully. Both have their pros and cons, but I prefer the implementation of the DS version. And this game also has the spin dash. Okay. Look, you're probably not going to use it a whole lot, but I still have used it occasionally. And I just appreciate a Sonic game allowing for rolling in general. I think it's so weird that the Wii version doesn't have that. And I'm sure speedrunners can get very creative with this. You can boost into a spin dash or spin dash into a boost, and it's rad. And if you run out of boost, it's just nice to have here. It's also nice to have the original rev up and jump noises. I love that. I also love that this version further emphasizes that the boost is a wisp power for Colors. Sonic doesn't even start the game with this ability. You have to go through all of Act 1 of Tropical Resort without it. This lets you appreciate a more standard Sonic moveset when you can't rely on the boost, and you get to appreciate the boost that much more when you're finally allowed to use all of its spoogey white wisp glory. The levels are designed with Sonic in mind, as opposed to feeling like it's plopping Sonic into someone else's game. It's an absolute thrill to play through. Even the wisps feel better here. You don't have to awkwardly stop everything you're doing. For the most part, the abilities keep the hedgehog moving. And this version of the game does have its own unique flavor of wisps as well. You have the burst ability, which will turn you into a fireball that you can charge up and launch off in any direction you feel like, helping you clear out dangerous bombs, which in turn will help you move forward or activate some fun level gimmicks. You also have the void ability, which is a little slower but is far more satisfying to maneuver and destroy things when compared to Frenzy. You may also notice that some wisp powers did not make it over to this version of the game, such as the hover or the block wisp. It's almost as if the mechanics and level design would not have meshed super well with blocks. Oh darn, what a shame. The rocket still has you launch up into the air and slowly float down, but again, I think it's better utilized here, like having to get enough momentum to launch up in the air, homing attack a line of enemies, pick up the rocket, and then activate it in that same spot before you drop back down to the earth below. They keep you moving forward, and you have to react quickly while you pick up the wisps. Oh god, and the drill! I will admit it is still a bit of a pain in the ass. They do constrict you quite a bit while having you get chased down by some big machines, which is a cool idea. I just needed a little bit more work. But if nothing else, I do appreciate the thematic consistency. It shows up on Planet Wisp, where all the construction is happening. That makes way more sense than the console version. That said, the map layout is largely similar to the console counterpart, but they have a clear distinction between acts and missions. Unlike the console game where everything is called an act, regardless of how long or short the level can be, the DS version made an obvious change with its more standard acts and these smaller, more focused missions. These also provide fun cameos for most of Sonic's cast. And yeah, they're mostly just still images, but it still adds a bit of character to this surprisingly empty world. And the DS map also gives you hints as to what you should be expecting in the acts themselves. What's that dinosaur corpse up to? Better go find out. I do think the console overworlds are a lot of fun in their own right, with plenty of detailed animation that's just fun to soak in, but there's nothing here indicating what these levels are all about, which kind of is the function of most other overworlds. The red rings here also represent the priority of each of the respective versions. A lot of the time, I feel like the DS red rings are placed in spots that will guide you through the optimal and usually most challenging route through a level, making you be as fast and efficient as possible with wisp and boost abilities. The console version has plenty of rings that feel similar to that, but a lot of the time you're gonna have to stop everything just to track one down or figure out a platforming puzzle. And obviously, since you have special stages separate from the red rings, those don't unlock Supersonic. They instead unlock concept art, which is nice. I don't know why that wasn't on the console version, but whatever, they're here. I also gotta say, I much prefer the multiplayer of the DS version. They don't have a bunch of levels set aside and built specifically for it like the console version. You have to play through the acts as they are, but again, these are just designed to move you through as quickly as possible, so they make for great race courses against an opponent, and they give you abilities to help you slow your opponent down, or in turn for you to dodge from your opponent. And they actually provided you a lot of ways to interact with other players. Multi-cart play, single cart play, local connection, Wi-Fi. Hell, if you wanted to just go solo, you can race an AI. And on top of all this, you get a time attack mode. None of this is mind-blowing, and it was also kind of standard, but these are still fun little extras to help get extended playtime from your game. And if that wasn't enough, there are special stages. Not this tedious block nonsense, just a good old-fashioned half-pipe, which, yeah, I know that's a bit overplayed, but I'd say it's utilized best here, because they have you use the touchscreen. You just pick up balls of a certain color like Sonic Heroes, but the touchpad is super responsive. Sonic is just as quick as your stylus, and I actually had a lot of fun going through these things. And while I can't unlock Super Sonic for the core levels, which does suck, you do at least get a true final boss, which I did appreciate. And it's against the Mother Wisp. Huh. Look, I know the Mother Wisp is a weird design, and this does feel like it kind of comes out of nowhere, but they do allude to it in the cutscenes, and yeah, there are a lot of spots in these quick cutscenes that seem to play up some fun concepts, including the corrupted Mother Wisp and the Nega Wisps being crazed, vicious versions of the standard variety. I should note that the actual final fight is extremely tedious, but I do love the idea. I really wish the console version played with this a bit more. Sure, we do have an unlockable Super Sonic, and I'm happy about that, but I don't know, man, secret final bosses bosses are a lot of fun. And speaking of the DS version, I even like the way they have you interact with each new wisp in a cutscene that has you utilize the touchscreen. I don't generally like the wisps, but at least the handheld version is making a big deal about unlocking a new ability, as opposed to just starting level and just running into it like the console version does. It's just crazy because all the lacking elements I found about the Wii edition seem to be made up for in the DS edition. This game sets Sonic the Hedgehog loose onto a theme park. How do you not go wild with that idea? There are a lot of great spots in the console version, but it also feels like it added all the long wait lines you'd find in real amusement parks. And when they baby it up as much as they do here, it makes me think this game doesn't think its players are tall enough to get on the rides. All of that said, though, I don't know if I would choose DS colors over console colors. While it does a lot of stuff the console version doesn't do, it really only shines in relation to the Wii counterpart. I couldn't even really call this the best Rush game. I'd just call it another Rush game. And while the console game is a bit too stiff and slow and Mario-y, this game goes into the other extreme. Rarely does it ever actually try to be a platformer, and you can thank the boost for that and wait for another video before we really pick that apart. And the few times it does force you to slow down, well, you ride a glowing whale. DS is fine if you are familiar with the Rush formula, or maybe handheld dimp Sonic in general, but looking at this from the perspective of someone who maybe has never even picked up a controller before, well, I think the Wii version makes a better first impression. I've seen a lot of people talking about the original Colors game like it was this obscure game that nobody had the chance to play. It stayed on just one console before it got ported to Ultimate, and yeah, that can't be denied. You can't really play it on other hardware outside of the Wii, but it was sold on the Wii, and it sold just about as well as Unleashed on less platforms. This is far from lost media, and ironically enough, being exclusive to Nintendo probably gave the game its best possible chance to succeed. And you might be asking, what exactly does that have to do with anything? Well, as much as I want Sonic to be this one specific thing, or how many other ideas were not utilized, or what came out after, I think it's important to understand the intent of the game itself and judge it on those merits, or at least put them into consideration. I've spent an obnoxious amount of time complaining and comparing this to Mario, and I do understand how ridiculous that sounds. That's like The Simpsons did it of video games. Comparing anything to Mario is just a moot point. Mario probably did it first. But I do again think there was a lot of intentional Mario choices made when making Sonic Colors. Again, Azuka said as much. And that's actually kind of brilliant. Sure, there is a lot of basic 2D platforming, but it makes the boost sections that much more appealing. And having all those gameplay elements mixed together in the same levels, that's a great way to get a kid who may have only ever known Mario games up to that point a little more accustomed to Sonic gameplay. That's literally what Sonic 1 did. And back in 2010, just like 1991, Sega would have been out of their minds not to tempt some Mario kids over to the blue side. And yes, I know there were a lot of great ideas left on the table with the adventure era, but the brand was not doing too hot back then. Each game was getting more and more panned with each release, and 06 was the breaking point, not just for gaming press, but for longtime fans, and for Sonic Team themselves. And the aftermath was so widespread that it went and affected the goodwill that Unleashed could have had. It's an undeniable improvement from 06 in terms of gameplay, and yes, I know a lot of people are coming out now and talking about how fun the game can actually be, but back then, if Sonic put one single red shoe out of line, there would be hell to pay. And seeing this giant, stretchy, slow variation was enough for me, and apparently a lot of others, to announce the game dead on arrival. Sega had to play it safe with their next title, and even that requires an extreme amount of precision. And having Dimps and Sonic Team just focus up on one console each, and very underpowered ones, was the smartest move to make, especially considering the consoles they were releasing on. As underpowered as they were, it cannot be understated just how well Nintendo's two game machines were doing at the time. As hard as it is right now in the year 2021 to find a PS5 or Series X, it was just as hard, if not more so, to track down a Nintendo Wii. And even then, it was hard to track down specific titles. Mario titles. Not so much Galaxy, Mario Kart certainly, but also
Super Mario Brothers. Whee!
A back-to-basics Mario game that was just doing crazy numbers. And Sega was not releasing a Sonic game for a Sega system to a Sega audience. They were releasing it on Nintendo hardware when Nintendo was at their absolute prime. Stronger than when Sega themselves fought them. The Switch might overtake one of them eventually, but as of right now, the Wii is still the best-selling Nintendo console ever, and the DS is still their best-selling handheld console ever. So yes, trying to attract the Mario crowd just made sense. And while the next game released on different hardware than the Wii, it sure got kids primed and ready for an even more refined boost game that celebrated the entire legacy of Sonic. That at the very least gives me some sense of appreciation. There's a larger conversation to be had, especially with hindsight and with Lost World and everything else under the belt, but just considering what this game was trying to do and who they were trying to appeal to, I think it did the job quite well. And not only that, despite my own complaints, there's actually a lot I love about this game. I don't go back and replay it all the time, but that aside, some of my favorite music tracks, gaming moments, setting, some of my favorite stuff from any part of the Sonic franchise is found right here in this game. Despite my complaints about the 2D sections of the Wii edition, like I keep saying, they did put in a lot of clever level design. Even the puzzle rooms have a flow about them, and it's satisfying to figure out. Sometimes it's okay to slow down for a second. I do think they went a bit too far in that regard, but a lot of this is going to come down to personal preference, as opposed to being actual flaws in the game design. I do like the DS game focusing more on Sonic's speed and keeping a consistent style of gameplay, but if I'm honest, it does drain on me a little bit. And look, I'm sorry, but spectacle matters when it comes to these games. The setting is wildly inventive and the soundtrack follows suit. The art direction is top-notch in colors, and there's this magical blend between the environments and the beats you'd hear while racing through them. There's always a lead-in with the music introducing you to the level with the loading screen before it drops that energetic melody as Sonic gets moving. And while I like to complain about the cutscenes, if you remove them, you'd probably have a solid understanding of what's going on in the narrative, a strength of the classic Sonic games at their full potential. And it's a shame the cutscenes take so much of the attention because what's being told in the melody of each track and in the settings, set pieces, backgrounds, layout, hazards, enemies, and boss battles can truly be engaging. Simple, sure, but where the words fall short in the narrative, everything else shines. The game starts at the tropical resort, completely different from your more natural settings Sonic games usually start in, but still tonally fitting as a starting area. This is where you arrive at the park. This is the Disneyland Main Street. This is where you shop. This is where you check into your hotel. This is the central hub where the rest of the park branches out. It's warm, welcoming, and celebratory. You practice homing attacks on balloon clusters. Even egg ponds are waving around welcome signs. All this while giving you a gorgeous view of the world below and teasing powers yet to be unlocked, inviting you to come back to the resort from time to time. And they'll do this for the rest of the game as you unlock Wisp powers. This game felt like a vacation from all the dreary drama surrounding this franchise. It makes you excited to see what other attractions await. And even if it's not Green Hill, even without all the natural vegetation, the theme is just as inviting, riding the waves of that surf rock guitar, all leading to that explosive party. And this gets remixed in different ways for each act going forward, and that's the case for every level. But like every other level, the first act's music is usually the strongest of the compositions. The next world from there is Sweet Mountain, and I don't care what anyone says, running around giant junk food is awesome. I absolutely love when the games get creative with level themes while staying consistent with the overall game setting. What kind of amusement park lacks concessions? This isn't a standard rinky-dink theme park, this is in space and they're gonna get ridiculous with it. Donuts, lollipops, hamburgers, popcorn actually popping as you roll through them, drifting through giant gingerbread men like you're a sore loser who just lost a game of Candyland. Willy Wonka can stuff his golden ticket. I'll die of diabetes at the peak of Sweet Mountain. As for the music, I don't know if it really tonally fits, but it's loud, it's bombastic, and it is unique on its own. I know exactly what that theme is the moment it starts playing. And there is still this artificial element to all of the environment if you look a little bit closely at the giant food on display. You'll see screws and panels showing that this isn't actually giant food all the time, and you do see some factory process going on here. And for some reason, jelly beans are being stored into missiles. Is this just a easier means to transport them around the park, or is this alluding to some candy-themed warfare? Wouldn't put it past Eggman. This is the same dude who had a fish-themed fleet. And speaking of fleets, up next is the Starlight Carnival, and despite some platforming tedium I've already talked about, the set pieces of this world are something special. Having Sonic run around a giant light parade, something that's usually bound to streets, is now blown up in the limitless expanse of outer space. But as you make your way through some of the innards of these ships, there seems to be something more sinister going on once you get past the bright lights. And later on in the first act, we see countless ships warp into uniform place. As you progress through the level, it looks less like a parade and more like an armada prepped for war. As big as the ideas of a theme park get in space, so too are the military capabilities of Eggman. And this level is showing us just how dangerous things can potentially get if Sonic doesn't put a stop to this carnival. And following all that up is Planet Wisp, and I'm sure plenty of you who originally checked Colors out back in the day might remember the opening moments of this world just as prominently, if not more so, than Tropical Resort. This is the turning point in our wordless narrative, where we push past all the bright lights, treats, and rides, and reveal something wonderful and horrible all at the same time. And that piano, while being another lead-in to an energetic track, has this beautiful sadness to it that isn't present in any other part of the soundtrack leading up to this point. The title scene cuts away, revealing a field of untamed grass, and as soon as Sonic is done stretching, he takes off. That sad piano now joined on stage by a more positive, energetic melody, something to get the player moving and motivated as the natural world is quickly stripped away by Eggman's construction. And you do hear thematic elements of that as well in the music as that carries on as well. We are halfway through the game, and only now are we seeing your standard forested green level you'd expect at the start of most Sonic games, placed in the middle, but still actually showing the same role, just all in one go, showing you the true, terrible cost of this ridiculous park. And like the music track, the level themes clash to create something unique. You're not actually on any part of the theme park for this area, and part of me always thought it was a little bit weird that they didn't show the theme park for Sonic Generations and instead showed off Planet Wisp, but considering the importance in the story and the kind of impact it left on us, I can understand why they went with that instead of anything else. Aquatic Park is a return to the park, and truth be told, there's not much new being added to the narrative itself. This is yet another attraction, which could be seen as something of a water park or a high-end sushi restaurant. Maybe a little mix of both. Regardless, this is a unique take on a water level, both with the setting, the more traditional Japanese theme infused with water hazards, as well as a new way for Sonic to traverse water. He can still slow down, but you actually can move him through the stuff by constantly jumping. You still have water bubbles, but also protective fish who can keep you from drowning. I already went over my general thoughts on the more open spaces with the drill, but it is kind of nice to have a different way to interact with this very notorious element of the franchise. Then we get to the final planetoid, Asteroid Coaster, and this one just looks straight up sinister, but I love how it's almost intentional. Like Eggman knew it was always going to look bad, so he just played into it. This looks dangerous, so of course, that's where you put the most thrilling rides. And I gotta say, at least for the main acts, the level layouts feel so clever. Again, mostly in the spots where Sonic is allowed to just be Sonic. I had so much fun jumping between roller coasters, homing to attack asteroids, zipping around planet rings. They totally missed a great spot for a Sega Saturn reference, but whatever. This area is exhilarating, and while all this is happening, the game is continuing its narrative. This is the horrible outcome of Eggman's abuse of the Wisps, turning them into Nega Wisps. This is where we're introduced to the barely controllable Frenzy, and it all makes for a great last level, all while fitting with the theme of being an amusement park. Then of course you have Terminal Velocity, which is a great set for escaping this craziness as it's blowing up, and the final boss itself. And maybe we don't have a final supersonic fight, but this still fits quite thematically with everything else going on here, and it's very satisfying to help Wisps escape and then have them all combined to take Eggman out once and for all. And that's not all I have to say about these level themes. It only now dawns on me after doing research for this video that there's a lot of Sonic 1 in these designs. And I'm not talking about the level layouts from the multiplayer stages, though those are very lovely references. I mean the themes themselves. Look at this concept art for Green Hill Zone. It's basically Tropical Resort. And if you think about it, the beta build had UFOs in the sky of Marble Garden, and if you look at the concept art for Marble Garden, garden, it's got these strange tiles just floating in the air, kind of like the ones you saw from Starlight Carnival. Oh, and actually, when you think about that name, we do have Starlight Zone, and good lord, look at that art. A water theme level with a lot of Japanese elements. And this is just what I could find on Sonic Retro. I can't even imagine what else we might be missing out on, and I sincerely doubt this is a coincidence. There's just a lot of parallels here. Isn't it funny? As much as I harped on Sonic Colors being a clone of a Mario game, it turns out this very same game stays truer to the original concepts of Sonic than even Sonic 1 did. Just, God, this game. When it comes right down to it, some of my biggest problems with the game is how limited I feel with interacting with these worlds, and again, even with the shorter 2D levels, there is a lot of interesting stuff happening here. Like, I know a lot of people found that burger level frustrating, but all you do is circle around this one giant patty, and if you're paying close enough attention to the drill tubes and grind rails, you can actually figure out a path before you even get to those sections. That's thinking in 2.5D. I know Dimps started the boost stuff, and they did a great job, but I think I just like how it feels a little bit more in 3D. I like seeing what's ahead of me, and I love looking at everything happening around me. The DS game, as focused as it can be, can provide that level of experience. Yes, running from a Ferris wheel is exhilarating, or T-Rex skulls. Does that mean they're alien dinosaurs? Whatever. But then you get hang gliding, which, I mean, that's nice. And the bosses really aren't anything to write home about on either version of the game. But for the DS version, you mostly have standard running around a ring like other Rush games, and I'm sorry Sonic, Klonoa already did that way better. They also try to emulate the console versions, but that doesn't really leave much of an impact. And while I like the idea of the Mother Wisp fight, it takes way too damn long and it's not remotely exciting. If you make a Super Sonic fight boring, you've screwed up somewhere. I do at least like the Nega Wisp armor incorporating Wisp powers, but if I had to choose between the console or DS version, the console version was way more fun. I found it genuinely challenging at first. It required that I put everything I had learned to the test and utilize and even combine Wisp powers in clever ways. It was only after that last boss fight that I actually feel okay with the other bosses not incorporating Wisp powers. But like I said up front, the other boss fights aren't off the hook. Between the two versions, console ones are much cooler, in concept at least. And that is my biggest problem with them. I don't get to spend enough time with these crazy designs. That, and I do feel the circular boss fights would have worked much better with classic Sonic mechanics. I love the Ferris wheel design of Tropical Resort. It's loud, it's bombastic, it's super intimidating, and it looks like it's gonna require a lot of thinking to figure out how to tackle this thing, but if you have the laser wisp, it's done in 2 hits. That's it. That's nothing. The size, the design of the arena, the threatening, awesome machine noise scream, and it's all over before it began. These boss fights look so cool, but it just doesn't do enough, which I guess I could say about Colors as a whole. I kind of trailed off my main point, but if you're wondering which is better between the Wii or DS version, I think the Wii will probably have the better overall experience, but the DS edition feels like it's doing all it can with the little it has to work with. I suppose it's nice that it's not just a lesser version of the console edition. It really does feel like it's trying to correct some design choices of its bigger brother. And while it doesn't look as nice, it does focus up on where it counts and provides a largely consistent gameplay experience. They provide something worthwhile that the other doesn't. And for that, I do think both deserve to be experienced. I'll put it this way, if Dimps was allowed to make the Wii version of the game with some Sonic Team supervision, that might have been the ultimate version of this game. But silly me, the ultimate version of Sonic Colors does exist, doesn't it? At least that's what they say in the name.